So our next presenter is Mauro Caraccioli, and he too will tell us the title of his book. And so Mauro, it's all yours.
All right. Okay, okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, Francois, and thank you, of course, to my colleagues on this roundtable, Caroline and Anna, to Linnea for all of her help today, and of course to all of you, right? Who presumably it would be a lot more fun if we could kind of hang out together and share. All of these great accomplishments, and especially to be able to kind of hold this up, right, and triumphantly celebrate that we have well these great books with us today. So I want to begin by saying, of course, that I'm thrilled to be here because after many years of being on the other side of these talks and not only watching, listening, but recording all of the amazing work that my colleagues have produced, it is actually no small exaggeration that, at least to some degree, all of you who are here today are responsible for me being here today alongside Caroline and Anna to share these texts. So to that end, I want to begin with a couple of acknowledgements. The first one is, of course, that for folks who are interested, the book has been made freely available in an open access edition, thanks to the very generous support of Virginia Tech and the Toward an Open Monograph ecosystem initiative that actually many of us in this session here have benefited from. So at some point in the talk today, I'm going to paste the publisher's book page where you can find the open access edition as well. More seriously now, and the second and perhaps arguably most important preface I want to make is a land acknowledgement. So I would like for us here to take a moment to acknowledge the Tutelo-Monacan people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, and to recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech and all of us here consume for our nourishment and well-being. We pay respect to the Tutelo-Monacan nations and to their elders, past, present, and emerging, to all of the women, men, and children whose actions precede our own works and whose memories, we hope, will outlast us well beyond when we are gone. So, as most of you know by now, land acknowledgements have become a central feature of the commitment to a culture of inclusion and respect that begins with those who were here first and whose continued presence is important to our future. For some, recognition is vital, regardless of whether Indigenous peoples have actual legal ownership of the land on which an event is taking place. For others, however, like myself, recognition that land, culture, practices, ideals for the future are regularly taken from people and appropriated in surreptitious ways is actually central to the claims that I make in this book and as part of my work. This is not only because the relationship of Indigenous people to their traditional country incorporates more than just ownership or occupation of land, but also because the complex histories of colonization across the Americas have had a devastating effect on Indigenous people. Acknowledgements such as this one are practices that promote awareness of and respect for Indigenous culture, ending various histories of silence and exclusion that have resulted in Indigenous disadvantage today. But in the book that I'm here to talk about today, which, as Francois asked me to say, is titled Writing the New World, The Politics of Natural History in the Early Spanish Empire, I examine the broader set of narratives and ideals that made possible that culture of exclusion under which many of us live today. At the heart of the book is the reconstruction of a period and series of episodes which themselves have been largely erased from conventional readings of the history of political thought, which is sort of my primary field of inquiry. Exclusions which, in my view, themselves make up a cascading series of omissions that distort the scholarly understanding of how the Americas, the New World, Tawantinsuyo, Tenochtitlan, Turtle Island, or whatever name the previous inhabitants of these lands had, for the riches that were there then and that are still here now. The book is the product of almost a decade thinking through the issues outlined above and questions that span the history of ideas, the history of religion and evangelization, the history of imperial science, and the wide array of demons, yes, demons, past and present, that haunt the efforts to make sense of and make meaning out of the incommensurable and the different. To that end, there are many devils in this book. Chief among them is the challenge posed to political theorists to take seriously the intellectual contributions of early modern Spanish and Spanish American thinkers in their efforts to make sense of nature and the peoples of the Americas at the dawn of modernity. More the result of omission than commission, misleading narratives about Spanish America produced by members of the early modern canon still retain a hold over the ways that political concepts, debates, and exemplary names of the 16th century are defined. As someone highly indebted to that same corpus, I've written this book to broaden its horizons and to rethink its political contours. And like countless post-colonial thinkers, I endeavor here to convey how historical domination is not only composed of epic conquests, but is also reproduced, even if inadvertently, via scholarly work. Specifically, the kind of inquiries I document here lie at the very heart of debates between the empirical and theoretical foundations of early modern political thought. That they happened at the other side of the known world, at a time when Europeans were only beginning to contemplate the existence of a literally unknown utopian space, is a key part of that story. Using Spain's politics of natural history in the New World as my central object of analysis, this book argues that the study of nature in the New World was about the cultivation of wonder, more so than merely extractive utilitarian interests. My aim is to show how the natural historical writings of chroniclers, explorers, and most notably, missionaries, helped to lay out a distinct set of empirical foundations for modern political thinking as these developed in the New World. Natural history, I maintain, was a contentious field of narrative inquiry and should be read today as a distinct genre of early modern political thinking. My approach in this book is to address the interplay between empire, faith, and the experience of New World environments, illustrating how different conceptions of nature shaped Imperial Spain's early efforts to cultivate a New World civilization. To do so, I focus on works attending to the distinctive ecological character of the Americas, lending greater attention to how early naturalist writings shaped the intellectual context of Spain's New World empire, particularly its millenarian ethos. This is sort of the part of the talk where I could kind of put a plug here for REM, right? That the period that I'm studying is the period not only where some Spaniards and the missionaries that I study feared that it's the end of the world as they know it, but they feel fine. But it's also a period where increasingly some of the figures that I study could arguably be saying that they were losing their religion, right? But by extension to the book's broader argument, I also demonstrate how spiritual wonder played a central role in making sense of the New World's exotic landscapes and peoples. Tracing the influence of religious conviction on the study of natural history in the New World, my aim is to broaden the evidentiary basis for rooting the scientific revolution in matters of faith as much as politics. Moving through two themes only cursorily engaged in by political theorists, the history of conquest narratives and missionary nature writing, I seek to unravel a long denounced but tenacious historiographical prejudice that portrays the Spanish Empire, and therefore its colonial holdings and subjects, as largely marginal features of modernity. In light of various historiographical advances, this is the first work of political theory that accounts for New World exploration and evangelization as a dual science of domination. Rather than portraying imperialism as a project forged from abroad, I offer instead a more complex genesis of the imperial ideals proffered by the study of nature within the Americas. Natural history's deployment led to enduring literary motifs in the representation of New World nature, as well as contentious depictions of a future colonial society. The case of Spanish natural history is thus a critical juncture in the relationship between science and empire. Driven by religious wonder, scientific inquiry thrived. Yet, as the empire grew unwieldy, the normative aspirations of naturalist thought were subsumed to instrumentalist economic growth. Spanish experiences of nature in the early modern period helped shape spiritual visions of the natural world, offered an adaptive discourse for empire, and called for a new map on which the future of civilization could be written. This vital period remains today a disputed space from which to convey the imperial politics of science, particularly as contemporary forms of environmental ethics today rediscover indigenous ways of relating to nature that reject romanticism and capitalist co-optation. This then is a story about faith as much as it is about nature in the first century of Spain's New World Empire. It aims at nothing less than providing the theoretical scaffolding to study this interplay of forces in light of a greater historiographical debate within the human sciences, what the historian Jorge Cañizares Guerra calls writing the history of the New World. In comparing the efforts of these chroniclers, explorers, and missionaries to make sense of New World nature, I demonstrate that the natural histories they forged as part of their various efforts exerted a decisive influence on the intellectual climate of Spain, its colonies, and Europe. They also produced conflicts of interest between the Spanish crown and its colonial representatives. As a historian of political thought, this juxtaposition helps me theorize Spain's empire in more varied ways, jettisoning the notion that Spanish rule operated singularly across distinct territories. Going further, my analysis also substantiates the effects of New World nature on different Spanish imperial imaginaries. At this point in kind of the last couple of minutes I have left, I want to sort of freely say what is that goes into the bulk of the book's substantive analysis. Through 4 different contextual portraits of 5 different figures, I focus on the ways in which the study of natural history evolved from a kind of Renaissance rhetorical art, if you will, to try to position the author, the historian, into the center of a particular drama that was unraveling at the time. And the way the field evolved, specifically through its interactions with indigenous peoples, with complex landscapes, with various kinds of cultures already present in the Americas, to become the more sort of scientific, allegedly objective, indeed somewhat neutrally seeming type of science that we're more familiar with today when we kind of think of ecological science and descriptive empiricism. The book looks at figures that are familiar to historians of political thought, like, of course, the Dominican friar Bartolomé Las Casas, and it also brings into the picture other figures that are perhaps known, but the extent of their work isn't quite as studied, such as, for instance, the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, who, throughout the course of a 30-year sojourn in the empire, composed one of the, in the colonies, that is, composed one of the most well-known catalogs of ethnographic information about the Nahua peoples of Mexico, including their language as well as visual representations of their ideals, the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, right? So a couple of people have already asked me where the cover image comes from. This comes from Sahagún's infamous Florentine Codex. I can say more about why it's called the Florentine Codex. And this particular image comes from Book 9 of the Codex that documents the different practices employed by feather workers. And this was at one of the famous missionary schools, the Colegio de Tlatelolco, where indigenous scribes, the great majority of them conscripts, were trained, if you will, as well as prepared to develop different varieties of visual and linguistic representation that the Franciscan missionaries could use to their ultimate goal, which was evangelization, as part of kind of a broader vision of extirpating the devil from the New World. To end, the way I connect those various portraits is to make a plea for thinking about natural history as more than just a kind of descriptive science, and to think of natural history itself as the stuff of civilization, that in the pursuits of political, legal, ontological domination, the figures that I write about were very much interested in thinking of natural history as a kind of shared form of inquiry, even if it's a flawed form of shared inquiry. Many of their views, as I try to document them, evolved throughout their time in the Americas. They evolved as a result of the violence that other elements of the Spanish Empire waged on the indigenous people. And they also evolved as their own prejudices were exposed in juxtaposition to the ideals and beliefs of indigenous peoples. So to that end, this is a book that's very much a history of dominators. It is a history of domination more so than of liberation. But my ultimate goal is to claim that by understanding that history of domination, we can lend greater voice to the kinds of struggles that we see today for more plural forms of inclusion and liberation. So I'll end on that note.